In the bone-deep cold of a Wyoming winter, one woman's choice would echo across the mountains like a gunshot. Her name was Isabella Beaumont, a widow living on the edge of civilization, and she found a man left for dead in the snow. But he wasn't a prospector or a trapper. He was a Shoshone warrior, the very man she'd been taught to fear. To save him meant risking everything: her home, her name, and her life. To let him die meant sacrificing a piece of her soul. She chose to save him. She never imagined that by spring he would return with his riders not for war, but with a question that could either save her or destroy her completely. The silence of the Wyoming high country in winter was a living thing. It wasn't an absence of sound, but a presence, a heavy white blanket that smothered the world and pressed in on the soul. For Isabella Beaumont, it was the sound of solitude. 3 years she'd been alone in the cabin her husband Robert had built, with his own 2 hands, nestled in a small, defensible valley against the foothills of the Wind River Range. Robert was gone, claimed by a rock slide the year before, last leaving Isabella with the cabin, a deed to 160 acres of unforgiving land, and a silence that was her constant companion. This morning the silence was different. It was fractured. She'd been checking her snares near the creek, the cold biting at the sliver of exposed skin between her wool scarf and the fur-lined hood of her coat. The crisp air carried sounds with startling clarity: the caw of a raven, the creak of a snow-laden pine bough, and something else. A rhythmic, labored sound like a broken bellows. Her hand went instinctively to the Winchester .73 rifle cradled in her arm. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned the pristine landscape. Then she saw it. A splash of crimson against the white, a disturbed patch of snow near a copse of aspens. It looked like a wolf kill, but there were no tracks leading away, only a messy, dragged furrow. Against every instinct that screamed for self-preservation, she moved closer. The sound grew louder, a desperate, wet rasping for air. There, half buried in a drift, was a man. He was Shoshone. His face, stark with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, was ashen under its copper skin. A buckskin shirt, dark with blood, was frozen stiff against his torso. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone clearly visible through a tear in his leggings. But it was the wound in his side that was killing him. A deep, ragged puncture, oozing blackish blood, that had melted a grisly crater in the snow. His eyes flickered open as she approached, dark and fathomless, but they held no recognition, only a primal spark of defiance, fighting against the encroaching darkness. He was young, perhaps her age, mid-20s. A single eagle feather was braided into his long black hair. A warrior. Isabella's heart hammered against her ribs. Every cautionary tale she'd ever heard screamed at her to turn back. The folks in Redemption's Bluff, the nearest settlement, a hard day's ride away, spoke of the Shoshone in whispers, blaming them for every missing head of cattle, every stroke of bad luck. The local cattle baron, Bartholomew Barth. Croft, a man whose influence was as vast and suffocating as the winter sky, was offering a bounty for any Indian scalp, no questions asked. To be found with a living wounded warrior was a death sentence. They would call her a traitor, an accomplice. Croft's justice was swift and brutal. She looked from the man's dying form to the cold, indifferent peaks. She thought of Robert, who had respected the Shoshone, who had studied their ways and their maps, believing they knew secrets of the land that no white man could grasp. "They belong to this place, Izzy," he used to say. "We're just visitors trying to learn the language." The man in the snow coughed a terrible rattling sound, and a fresh bloom of red appeared on his lips. His eyes found hers again, and for a fleeting second, the defiance was replaced by something else. A plea. Not for his life, he was too proud for that. but a plea to be seen to not die, alone, and unremembered, a nameless stain on the snow. In that moment, the warnings of Redemption's bluff faded. The fearsome shadow of Bath Croft receded. All she saw was a human being, dying in the brutal cold. Her training as a doctor's daughter, the long hours spent watching her father mend broken bodies in Philadelphia before she'd followed her heart west, took over. "Damn it all," she whispered to the wind, the words turning to frost in the air. "Damn it all to hell." The man was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Gritting her teeth, she looped her arms under his, her boots, slipping in the blood-soaked snow as she began to drag him. Every foot was a monumental effort, a new protest from her screaming muscles. She didn't drag him toward the main cabin that was too obvious, too exposed. Instead, she hauled him towards the small stone-walled root cellar, dug into the hillside 100 yards away, its heavy wooden door almost completely hidden by a deep drift. The cellar was her larder, her sanctuary of preserved food and hope for the spring. Now it would become a different kind of sanctuary, a secret one. With a final desperate heave, she got him through the door and into the frigid dark. She stumbled back out into the blinding white, her breath coming in ragged plumes. She grabbed a spare shovel and worked frantically, scooping fresh snow over the bloody trail, over the drag marks, over every trace of her crime. She worked until her back ached and sweat froze on her brow, her movements frantic and precise. She was not just covering tracks. She was burying Isabella Beaumont, the cautious widow. And she was unearthing someone she hadn't known existed. Someone who, in the face of certain death, chose defiance. As she finally laid the shovel down, the silence returned heavier than before. But now it was filled with the secret knowledge of the man lying in her cellar, a man suspended between life and death. His fate, and now hers, lay hidden beneath the snow. The darkness of the root cellar was absolute smelling of damp earth potatoes, and now the metallic tang of blood. Isabella worked by the weak, flickering light of a single tallow candle, its flame dancing in the draughts and casting long, monstrous shadows on the stone walls. She had stripped the warrior of his frozen, bloody buckskins, an act that felt both intimately clinical and profoundly dangerous. His body was a road map of a hard life. Old scars crisscrossed his chest and arms, but his flesh was lean and powerful. The wound in his side was worse than she'd feared. It looked like a pitchfork wound, deep and dirty, already showing the angry red edges of infection. The broken leg would have to wait. If the fever took him, the leg wouldn't matter. "All right now," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Let's see what my father taught me." She had brought her medical supplies down from the cabin, a small wooden box containing her father's surgical tools, clean linen carbolic acid for cleansing, and a jar of potent willow bark salve for pain and fever. The man whom she had decided to call Di, in her mind, a name she'd read in one of Robert's books, meaning eagle, was drifting in and out of consciousness. His breathing was shallow, his skin burning to the touch. She cleaned the wound first, her movements deft and sure. He flinched, a low groan escaping his lips, his hand clenching into a fist. "I know," she whispered, her voice soft. "I know it hurts. Just hold on." She packed the wound with a poultice of crushed yarrow to stanch the bleeding and mashed garlic to fight the infection herbs she grew in a small protected patch during the summer and dried for the winter. It was Shoshone medicine, ironically, knowledge Robert had learned from them and passed on to her. She bound the wound tightly with clean linen torn from her own petticoats. Next, the leg. It was a clean break of the tibia, but setting it alone was a brutal task. She used 2 sturdy splints cut from a spare axe handle and more linen strips. He cried out this time, a sharp, guttural sound that was cut off as he bit down on the leather strap she'd wedged between his teeth. His eyes, lucid for a moment, burned into hers with pure, unadulterated agony. Isabella didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her own steady and determined, as she pulled the bone into place with a sickening crunch. He went limp, passing out from the pain. For 3 days and 3 nights, the cellar became her world. She slept on a pile of burlap sacks near the door, waking every hour to check on him. She spooned broth and willow bark tea between his lips, forcing him to drink. The fever raged. He thrashed in his delirium, speaking in a language she didn't understand, his words sharp and urgent. In those fevered ramblings, she heard names, cries of battle, and softer sounds that might have been prayers. She saw not just a warrior, but a man with a life, and a people who were likely mourning him. On the 4th day, the fever broke. She came down the steps to find him awake, his eyes clear and calm. He was weak, but the fire was gone. He watched her silently as she changed his dressings. The wound was still angry, but the infection had not spread. Communication was a slow, patient dance of gestures and drawings. She learned his name was indeed Di. He learned hers was Isabella. He would point to objects, the candle, the water bucket, the bread she brought him, and she would say the English word. He would repeat it, his pronunciation, careful his voice, a low, pleasant rumble that seemed out of place in the cramped cellar. He used a piece of charcoal on a spare plank of wood to draw. He drew a picture of his party, 10 men hunting bison. Then he drew other men, white men, on horseback, not in army blue, but in rough civilian clothes. He drew them firing without warning. He drew a pitchfork. He drew himself, falling his comrades, scattering under a hail of bullets. A cold knot formed in Isabella's stomach. This wasn't a skirmish with the army. This was an ambush, an execution. Her trips to the cellar were a constant risk. She had to vary her times, check the horizon for any sign of a rider, and make sure her own tracks to and from the hillside were obscured by the daily chores of hauling water and chopping wood. The paranoia was a constant bitter taste in her mouth. It was a week after she brought Di in that her fears took on a face. A rider was approaching, not from the direction of the pass, but from the lowlands, from Redemption's bluff. It was Bartholomew Croft. Her heart leapt into her throat. She quickly kicked snow over the cellar door, grabbed her wood axe, and began splitting logs with a ferocity she didn't feel trying to look as mundane and occupied as possible. Croft reined in his magnificent black stallion a few feet away, looking down at her from his elevated position. He was a large man, barrel-chested with a florid face and pale, cunning eyes that missed nothing. He wore an expensive tailored sheepskin coat that screamed of wealth and power. "Mrs. Beaumont War," he said, his voice a deceptively smooth baritone. "Surviving the winter, I see. Commendable." "Mr. Croft," Isabella replied, not stopping her work. The axe striking wood was a punctuation to her words. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Just checking on my neighbors," he said, his eyes scanning her property. They lingered on the smoke rising from her cabin's chimney, on the neatly stacked woodpile, and then drifted toward the hillside where the cellar was hidden. "Heard some commotion up this way a week or so back. Sounded like gunfire." Isabella's blood ran cold. "Wolves," she said, splitting a log with a clean crack. "Got a little too close to my chickens. My Winchester encouraged them to leave." Croft smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. "Is that so funny? My men and I had a run-in ourselves. A band of Shoshone renegades, trespassing, stealing my cattle." He paused, letting the lie hang in the air. "We taught them a lesson about private property. Most of them won't be back. But 1 or 2 might have scattered. You haven't seen any strays, have you? A wounded buck, perhaps?" His gaze was a physical weight. He knew, or he suspected, which was just as dangerous. She could feel his questions probing at her, searching for the slightest crack in her composure. "If I saw a stray on my land, Mr. Croft, I imagine my Winchester would be the last thing he saw," she said, her voice hard as iron. "I value my scalp." Croft chuckled a low, humorless sound. "Good girl. Just be careful. This is a hard country for a woman alone." He tipped his hat. "You need anything, you just send word to Redemption's Bluff. I'm always happy to help a neighbor in need." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving Isabella shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. The encounter had been a warning. Croft wasn't just on a fishing expedition. He was tightening a noose. As his figure disappeared over the ridge, she hurried to the cellar. Di was sitting up his back against the wall. He must have heard the voice. He looked at her, his dark eyes asking the question she couldn't answer. How long could they keep this secret? She gave him a small, tight smile. "We're all right," she lied, her voice unsteady. "For now." But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the winter was far from over, and the real storm was yet to come. The weeks following Bath Croft's visit were a slow-burning fuse. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching rider. Isabella lived on a knife's edge, her existence pared down to two starkly different worlds, the open, sun-bleached terror of the surface and the dark, secret intimacy of the cellar. Down below, Di was healing. The gash in his side was closing, knitting itself into a jagged scar. The bone in his leg was mending. He was carving again, not battle scenes, but images of his life before the ambush. A camp by a river horses, grazing in a green valley, the face of a woman who might have been his mother, and a small boy his son, or perhaps a younger brother, learning to shoot a bow. He taught Isabella the Shoshone word as for these things: apifor, river puku for horse, tini for boy. In turn, she taught him more English. He learned quickly, his mind as sharp as the flint he used for carving. They developed a shorthand, a language all their own, made of halting words and expressive gestures. A bond was forming between them, forged in secrecy and shared vulnerability. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was a deep, powerful current of mutual respect. He saw her not as a fragile white woman, but as Nyave, a word he taught her meant one who is brave. She saw him not as a savage, but as a man of quiet dignity and profound sorrow. One afternoon, he drew a new picture in the dirt floor of the cellar. It was a map of her valley, remarkably accurate. He pointed to a spot high up in the foothills, a place Robert had spoken of, a hidden box canyon. Then he drew symbols, strange rocks, a rushing stream. He looked at her, his expression intense, and pointed from the map to her, then to himself. He was trying to tell her something about the land, something Robert had also been searching for. Before she could decipher it, he wiped the drawing away, his eyes darting toward the cellar door, a gesture that meant danger. The danger came not from Croft, but from a more insidious source, a supposed friend. Elias Vance was a trapper who wintered in a small cabin downriver. He was a gaunt, weathered man with shifty eyes and a perpetual need for credit at the trading post in Redemption's Bluff. He'd always been friendly enough to Isabella, trading her beaver pelts for flour and salted pork. He stopped by once a month, a welcome break in the monotony. He arrived on a day when a heavy snow had just begun to fall. Isabella greeted him cautiously at her door. "Just checking in, Mrs. Beaumont," he said, stamping snow from his boots. "Making sure you ain't gone snow crazy yet." He offered a weak, tobacco-stained smile. Got a couple of prime pelts for you, if you can spare a bit of coffee." She couldn't turn him away without raising suspicion. She let him in her mind, racing. Di was quiet in the cellar, but what if he coughed? What if Elias needed to use the privy, which was near the cellar hill? "Coffee's on the stove," she said, forcing a casual tone. They sat at her small kitchen table. Elias's eyes darted around the cabin. "You're using more firewood than usual," he commented, gesturing with his thumb toward her woodpile, which was indeed smaller than it should be. She burned a second smaller fire in the cellar to keep Di from freezing. "Colder winter than last," she replied smoothly. His gaze then fell on her medicine box, which she'd foolishly left on a shelf. "Looks like you've been playing doctor." "Just mixing some poultices for my chickens," she lied. "They've been getting sick." Elias grunted, but his eyes held a flicker of something she didn't like. Greed. He knew Croft was offering rewards for information. He owed the man money. A desperate man was a dangerous animal. He finished his coffee quickly and left with his provisions, leaving Isabella with a profound sense of unease. Her fears were realized 2 days later. The blizzard hit with the force of a physical blow, a howling vortex of wind and blinding snow that erased the world. It was the kind of storm that kept honest folk by their fires and gave villains cover. In the heart of the storm they came. A loud bang on her cabin door startled her from a light doze. It wasn't a knock. It was the butt of a rifle. Isabella Beaumont. Bath Croft's voice boomed, barely audible over the gale. "Open this door. We know he's here." Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. She looked wildly around the cabin. There was no escape. She ran to the trap door in the floor that led to the crawl space, not the root cellar. It was a foolish hope. The door splintered and burst inward. Croft stood there, flanked by 3 of his hard-faced ranch hands and a sheepish-looking Elias Vance, who refused to meet her eyes. Croft's face was flush with triumph. "The trapper here says you've been tending to some sick chickens." Croft sneered, snow melting on his coat. "Funny he said he heard them coughing like a man. We followed the tracks he found, the ones you missed." He pointed a pistol at her. "Where is he, the cellar?" Isabella stood, frozen her heart, a block of ice. Before she could answer, one of Croft's men, a brute named Pike, shoved past her and headed for the cellar hill. A primal scream of rage tore from Isabella's throat. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace and swung it with all her might, catching Pike across the back of his knees. He howled and crumpled to the floor. Croft backhanded her, sending her sprawling. "Foolish woman!" He hissed, his face contorted with fury. But her desperate act had bought a few precious seconds. From outside came a shout, then a gunshot muffled by the storm, then another. Through the howling wind, she saw a shape emerge from the cellar. It was Di. He wasn't armed with a rifle, but with the splint from his leg, a sharpened piece of hickory. In his other hand, he held the heavy bar from the cellar door. He moved with a limp, but with a terrifying, silent grace, a predator in the white chaos. One of Croft's men charged him. Di sidestepped, swinging the iron bar in a brutal arc that connected with the man's head. He went down and didn't move. "Shoot him!" Croft roared, leveling his pistol. But the blizzard was their ally. The wind whipped the snow into a disorienting frenzy. Di was a phantom there, one moment gone the next. He used the woodpile, the corner of the cabin, the very storm itself, as cover. Another shot rang out, and another of Croft's men cried out, clutching a leg that had been shattered by the thrown hickory splint. Croft, enraged, fired blindly into the swirling snow. Isabella saw her chance. While he was distracted, she grabbed her Winchester from its rack by the door. She didn't aim at Croft, she wasn't a killer, but she fired into the air above his head. The crack of the powerful rifle so close to his ear made him stagger back, disoriented. In that moment of confusion, a dark shape darted from behind the cabin, scooped up the fallen man's rifle and vanished into the white hell of the storm. It was Dye. He was armed. And he was free. Croft spun around his face, a mask of pure hatred, and pointed his pistol directly at Isabella's heart. "You will pay for this," he snarled, his voice low and shaking with rage. "When this storm breaks, this valley will be your grave." He and his remaining man, dragging their injured companions, retreated into the blizzard, leaving Isabella alone in her ruined cabin, the wind howling through the broken door like a lament. She had saved Dye, but she had damned herself. The snow was no longer a blanket. It was a shroud. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, imprisoning Isabella in the wreckage of her life. When the wind finally died, and a weak, watery sun broke through the clouds, the world was reborn in an almost blinding purity of white and blue. But the beauty was a lie. Her front door was a splintered ruin. Inside, overturned furniture and shattered crockery testified to Croft's fury. Outside, the snow was scarred with the tracks of the fight and the retreat, and stained with frozen blood. She was utterly alone, and for the first time since Robert's death, she felt a despair so profound it was like a physical weight crushing her chest. Redemption's Bluff was now enemy territory. Bath Croft had marked her for death, and Elias Vance's betrayal had shown her she had no friends there. She was an outcast, a pariah. The first week was about survival. She nailed planks over the broken door, turning her home into a fortress against the cold. She righted the furniture, swept the broken glass, and tried to impose order on the chaos, a small act of defiance against the hopelessness that threatened to consume her. Her food stores, thankfully, were mostly in the now empty cellar and had been untouched. But they were finite. The winter stretched before her, a vast, frozen expanse of time. She thought constantly of Dye. Was he alive? Had he found shelter? An unarmed, wounded man in a blizzard? The odds were impossibly long. Guilt gnawed at her. She had saved him only to send him to his death. Her life became a monastic routine. Rise before dawn. Check the snares, they were usually empty. Chop wood. Haul water. Huddle by the fire, mending clothes, and reading Robert's books by candlelight to keep her mind from splintering. The silence was back, but it was no longer a companion. It was an accuser filled with the ghosts of what she had lost and the spectre of what was to come. Croft made his presence felt without ever showing his face. One morning, she found one of her hens lying in the snow with its neck broken. A few days later, the small stack of hay she kept for the mule was mysteriously scattered to the winds. These were petty acts of cruelty, psychological warfare designed to break her spirit, to remind her she was being watched to starve her out. It was during this long, dark period that she turned to Robert's work for solace. She spread his geological maps across the floor, his precise drawings and cryptic notes. He had been obsessed with this valley. The official survey maps showed it as unremarkable, but Robert believed they were wrong. He wrote of strange quartz formations of water that tasted of unusual minerals, and of a vein of sleeping fire deep within the box canyon Dye had drawn in the dirt. One night, reading by the fire, she found a hidden flap in his leather journal. Inside was a letter written in his hand, addressed to her. It was a letter to be read only upon his death. "My dearest Izzy," it began his familiar script, making her ache with loss. "If you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass. I have not been entirely truthful with you about my work here. It is not gold I have been searching for. It is something far more valuable to the right people. This valley contains one of the richest deposits of high-grade graphite in the entire territory. Not the stuff of pencils, my love, but the kind needed for the new Bessemer steel process, back east. It's the future. Fortunes will be built on it. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The letter continued. I have told no one, save for one man, the leader of the Shoshone band that calls this valley their sacred winter home. His name is Washakie. We made an agreement. I would help him petition Washington to have this land incorporated into the reservation, protecting it for his people in exchange for a share of the mining rights. But there is another who suspects. Barth Croft. He has been trying to buy my land, then threatening me. He knows something is here. Be careful of him, Izzy. He is a man without a soul. The maps are the key. Don't let him get them. Suddenly, everything clicked into place. Robert's rock slide had been no accident. Croft had murdered him for his maps for the secret of the valley. And the ambush on Dye's hunting party wasn't just about land. It was about eliminating the Shoshone claim to the graphite, a claim Croft now knew about through his own brutal reconnaissance. Her personal struggle was part of a much larger, deadlier game. This knowledge didn't break her. It forged her despair into a cold, hard resolve. She was no longer just a survivor. She was the guardian of Robert's legacy and the keeper of a promise made to the Shoshone. Her fight was now for justice. The days grew infinitesimally longer. The iron grip of the frost began to loosen. The snow, once a symbol of her imprisonment, began to melt, revealing patches of brown, dormant earth. The long thaw had begun. One crisp morning as she went to the well for water, she saw it. Stuck into the wooden frame of the well house was a single perfect eagle feather. It hadn't been there the night before. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the horizon, the tree line, the high ridges, but saw nothing. No tracks. No sign of a visitor. It was as if a ghost had left it. But it was no ghost. It was a message. Dye was alive. He was watching over her, and he had not forgotten. Holding the feather in her hand, Isabella looked up at the vast Wyoming sky, a real smile touching her lips for the first time in months. The thaw was not just in the land. It was in her soul. The fuse that had been lit months ago was now burning toward its end. Spring was coming, and with it a reckoning. Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as a muddy, turbulent rebirth. The creek swelled into a brown, churning torrent, and the valley floor became a mire. For Isabella, the change of seasons brought not relief, but a gnawing anxiety. The melting snow meant the pass to Redemption's Bluff was open. The roads were clear. Croft could come for her at any time. Her supplies were dangerously low. She was down to her last sack of flour and a handful of beans. The eagle feather was her talisman, a constant source of hope, but hope couldn't fill a stomach. She had to take a risk. She packed her mule, took her Winchester, and set out for the settlement, hoping to trade the last of Robert's geological tools for enough food to last until she could plant a garden. The atmosphere in Redemption's Bluff was colder than any winter day. As she walked her mule down the muddy main street, windows were shuttered, doors closed. The few people she saw turned their faces away, scurrying into the general store or the saloon. Elias Vance's betrayal had poisoned the well completely. She was a leper. The final inevitable confrontation happened as she was tying her mule outside the trading post. Bartholomew Croft, flanked by the town marshal, a man named Calloway, who was squarely in Croft's pocket, and two of his ranch hands stepped out to block her path. Isabella Beaumont. Croft said, his voice dripping with false civility. Fancy seeing you. I was just on my way out to your place. He held up a sheaf of papers. A little matter of some outstanding debt. Seems your late husband borrowed a considerable sum from me before his accident. Pledged the land as collateral. The debt is past due. I'm afraid the land, the cabin, everything on it is now mine." Isabella stared at the papers, her blood running cold. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but his signature was there next to a clumsy forged version of Robert's, and Marshal Calloway was nodding grimly, a symbol of the law's corruption. "That's a lie," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "My husband never borrowed a cent from you." "The law says otherwise," Croft said with a smug smile. "Calloway here has the eviction notice. You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings and vacate my property. After that, you'll be trespassing." It was the final checkmate. He had taken her reputation, her safety, and now he was taking her home the last piece of Robert she had left. Tears of helpless fury pricked her eyes. The townsfolk who had gathered at a distance watched in silence, their faces a mixture of pity and fear. No one would help her. She was beaten. As Marshal Calloway stepped forward to hand her the notice, a sound made everyone pause. It was a low rumble, distant at first, like thunder in the foothills. But it grew steadily louder, resolving itself into the rhythmic beat of dozens of hooves. Every head turned toward the west, toward the pass, leading into the high country. They appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. Riders. At least 30 of them. They weren't soldiers or cowboys. They were Shoshone. They moved with a fluid discipline, fanning out along the ridge in a display of silent, intimidating power. They were painted not for war with its stark reds and blacks, but with the ceremonial ochres and whites of a formal council. Yet every man carried a rifle across his lap, and their collective gaze was fixed on the town below. They parted, and a single rider began to descend the trail. He rode a proud paint horse, and he sat tall and straight. The limp was almost unnoticeable. His hair was braided with 2 eagle feathers now. As he drew closer, Isabella's heart stopped. It was Di. He rode directly into the center of the muddy street and reined in his horse, his eyes locking with hers. For a moment, the world fell away. There was only the man she had saved, and the woman who had been saved in return. He was no longer the broken, feverish man from her cellar. He was a leader, radiating an aura of calm authority that eclipsed Croft's blustering power. Another warrior, an older man with a wise, weathered face, rode up beside him. The older man spoke first, his English heavily accented but clear. "I am Tave Council Elder. This man is Di, son of our chief. He has told us what you did, Isabella Beaumont. You saved the life of our future." Croft let out a derisive snort. "This is town business, Marshal. Run these savages out of here." But Marshal Calloway didn't move. He, like everyone else, was mesmerized by the silent warriors on the hill. Di raised a hand, and Tave fell silent. Di looked directly at Croft, his expression as hard and unyielding as granite. Then he looked at Isabella, and his face softened. He spoke, and Tave translated, though Isabella found she understood the meaning, even before the English words came. "The woman with the heart of a warrior saved my life," Di said, his voice carrying in the sudden silence. "She gave me shelter when my own people thought me dead, and she faced this man's anger for me. The Shoshone do not forget such a debt. We do not forget such courage." He dismounted, handing his reins to Tave. He walked toward Isabella, his eyes never leaving hers. He stopped a few feet from her. "My people would call you sister," he said, his voice low and intense. "They would welcome you to our fires as one of our own. But a sister's protection is not enough for what this man will do." He took a breath, and his next words stunned the entire town into silence. "I would call you wife." He held out his hand. "This land your husband died for, this valley my people hold sacred, is now under threat. Alone we may be broken. Together we are a mountain that cannot be moved." Will you marry the man whose life you hold, Isabella Beaumont? Will you join your courage to mine, and our people's, together to make a new future in this valley?" It wasn't just a proposal of the heart. It was a declaration of war and an offer of alliance. It was a political masterstroke, a strategic maneuver that changed the entire landscape of power in the valley. Marrying her, a white landowner, would give Dai's people a legitimate, undeniable claim to the valley in the eyes of the white man's law, a claim even a corrupt marshal would have trouble ignoring. Isabella looked from Dai's earnest, hopeful face to Croft's, which was now a mask of purple apoplectic rage. She looked at the silent, watching townsfolk and at the formidable line of warriors on the hill. Her choice was clear. It had been made the moment she dragged a dying man from the snow. The silence that followed Dai's proposal was thick and heavy, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses and the drip of melting snow from the rooftops. Every eye in Redemption's bluff was on Isabella. Bath Croft's face was a storm of disbelief and fury. He had her cornered, beaten, and in one move, this Shoshone warrior had redrawn the entire map. Isabella felt a strange calm settle over her. The fear was gone, replaced by a crystalline certainty. This was her path. This was the answer to the loneliness, the injustice, the fight for Robert's legacy. It was all woven together in the person of the man standing before her. She looked past Dai for a moment, to the older warrior Tave. He was holding a leather-bound book, her husband's journal. Dai had not just survived, he had recovered Robert's belongings from the site of his accident. "Before you answer," Dai said, his eyes flicking to Croft, "there is a matter of justice." He gestured to Tave, who rode forward and handed the journal to Marshal Calloway. "Open it," Dai commanded. Calloway, his face pale and sweating despite the chill, fumbled with the clasp. He opened it to a page marked by a strip of rawhide. It was the last entry Robert had written. Tave's voice rang out, translating as Dai spoke. The words of Robert Beaumont. He writes of his discovery. He writes of his partnership with our people. And he writes of his fear of one man. Dai's gaze was like a physical blow. He writes that Bath Croft threatened to kill him and take his maps the day before he died. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This wasn't an Indian's accusation. This was a white man's words from beyond the grave. "That's not all," Dai continued. He pulled a small, grimy ledger from his own saddlebag. "This belonged to one of the men who ambushed my hunting party. The man Isabella Beaumont stopped with her fire poker. In his haste, he left it behind." He tossed the ledger into the mud at Calloway's feet. "It details payments from Croft, for cattle rustling, blamed on my people, for scouting Robert Beaumont's claim, and a final large payment dated the day after my friend Robert died." The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Croft's web of lies, so carefully constructed, had been torn apart. The townspeople were no longer looking at Isabella with pity, but at Croft with dawning horror and contempt. They had lived under his thumb for years, cowed by his power, but the truth was a liberating force. Marshal Isabella said, her voice clear and strong, finding its power for the first time in public. "You have a murderer's confession in your hands. What are you going to do?" Calloway looked from the damning evidence to Croft's murderous face, and then up at the 30 silent rifles on the ridge. His loyalty to Croft was a thing of convenience and fear, and the balance of power had just seismically shifted. He made the only choice a man in his position could. "Bartholomew Croft," Calloway said, his voice trembling slightly as he drew his pistol. "You are under arrest for the murder of Robert Beaumont." "You sniveling coward!" Croft roared, his hand flying to his own holstered gun. But he was too slow. Two of Dai's warriors, moving with blurring speed, were suddenly beside him, their rifles pressed to his ribs. Croft froze, his face collapsing into a mask of defeated hatred. With the reckoning delivered, Dai turned his full attention back to Isabella. The fire of the warrior was gone, replaced by the quiet intensity of the man. His outstretched hand still waited. "Isabella," he said, his voice for her alone. "My question stands." She stepped forward, placing her hand in his. His skin was warm, his grip strong and sure. It felt like coming home. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "Yes, I will marry you." A cheer went up from the Shoshone on the hill, a wild, ululating cry of triumph that echoed through the valley. The townspeople, freed from Croft's shadow, began to talk excitedly amongst themselves, the spell of fear broken. Isabella stood beside Dai, their hands clasped, facing the town together. It was not the end of their story. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. They would have to navigate the treacherous currents of two cultures of prejudice and of a government that saw her husband's land as a prize to be won. But for the first time, she was not alone. She had an ally, a partner, a husband, looking out at the muddy street of Redemption's Bluff, with the warriors of her new family watching from the hills, and the man whose life she had saved standing beside her. Isabella Beaumont felt the last of the winter's chill leave her soul. It was a new dawn, not just for the valley but for her. A new life forged in blood and snow was just beginning. The arrest of Bath Croft did not bring silence. Instead, a hesitant murmur rippled through the crowd of townspeople, the sound of a community finding its voice after years of forced quiet. Marshal Calloway, eager to cement his newfound allegiance to justice, hauled the snarling cattle baron toward the town's small jailhouse. "This ain't over." Beaumont Croft bellowed, his face purple with rage, his eyes locking on Isabella. "My reach is long. You and your savage husband will see his threats faded as the heavy oak door of the jail slammed shut. For a moment, Isabella and Dai stood in a pocket of stillness amidst the burgeoning commotion. The raw public declaration of their union hung in the air as real and tangible as the muddy ground beneath their feet. Then the townsfolk began to move, their fear of Croft slowly being replaced by curiosity and a cautious respect. An older man with hands stained by charcoal and a leather apron smelling of the forge stepped forward. It was Owen Blackwood, the town blacksmith, a man of few words but respected for his integrity. He ignored the Shoshone warriors, his eyes fixed on Isabella. "Mrs. Beaumont," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That man, Croft, he bled this town dry. What you did today, what you both did." He glanced at Dai, giving a slow, deliberate nod. "It took guts. If you need supplies, if that deed of yours needs a proper seal from a witness, my door is open." He didn't offer a handshake or a smile, but his words were stronger than steel, a bridge being built across a chasm of mistrust. One by one, others followed. A woman offered a small bag of potatoes. The trading post owner promised her credit was good again. They weren't welcoming Dai with open arms. The sight of 30 armed warriors on the ridge was still a potent deterrent to outright friendliness, but they were accepting Isabella back into the fold, and by extension, acknowledging the new reality she brought with her. Dai watched this unfold, his expression unreadable, but for a flicker of understanding in his dark eyes. He gave a quiet order in Shoshone. His riders, who had begun to descend from the ridge, halted, maintaining their respectful but watchful distance. He understood that bridges were built one plank at a time. He turned to Isabella, his gaze gentle. "It is time," he said, his English careful. "This place is not our home." She nodded, feeling a profound sense of release. She retrieved her mule, its saddlebags, still empty, and mounted. Dai swung onto his paint horse, and together they led the procession out of Redemption's Bluff. They rode not as conquerors but as partners, leaving a negotiation, the silent warriors falling into a protective formation behind them. The journey back to the valley was imbued with a surreal peace. The air was clean, the sky was a vast, brilliant blue, and the sound of the horses' hooves was a steady, reassuring rhythm. When they were out of sight of the town, Dai guided his horse alongside hers. "Your people," he began, searching for the words. "They fear us. They feared Croft more," Isabella replied, looking at his strong profile. "You gave them their courage back today." "You gave me my life back," he countered simply. He reached into a pouch at his side and handed her Robert's journal. "Your husband was a good man. An honorable man. He saw the land not for what he could take, but for what it was. Tav, our elder, says he had Sogonia, an earth spirit." Isabella clutched the journal to her chest, the worn leather, a final, tangible piece of the man she had loved. "He would have liked you, Dai. He believed your people and ours could share this land," We Will Die said with certainty. "The sleeping fire, the graphite your husband found. It can build a future for all of us. New schools for our children, new tools for your people. It does not have to be a thing that divides us." This was the vision behind his proposal, she realized. It was larger than both of them. It was about creating a legacy of cooperation, not conflict. Her heart swelled with a feeling she hadn't expected, not just respect or gratitude, but a deep, resonant affection. She had said yes for survival and justice, but now she felt the stirrings of something more. When they arrived back at the homestead, the place felt transformed. The small, lonely cabin no longer seemed like an outpost at the edge of the world. With Dai's warriors camped respectfully by the creek, it felt like the heart of a vibrant community. Before she could even ask, two of the men were at her front door, skillfully mending the splintered wood with tools from their own packs, their movements efficient and sure. As the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Dai stood with her on the porch. The door was whole again. The valley was quiet. "Tomorrow we will hold a council," he said softly. "Tav will speak the words that bind us. It will be a Shoshone way." He paused, turning to face her fully. "It will not be the way of your people, but it will be true." "Truth is all I ask for," she said, meeting his gaze. He nodded, a rare, small smile touching his lips. "I knew you had Nieve when you pulled me from the snow. But I see now it is more. It is the same as your husband's Sogonia. You do not just live on this land. You are part of it." And now he said, his hand, gesturing to the valley, to the warriors, to the cabin, "It is part of us." The path ahead was unpaved, full of rocks and ruts she couldn't yet see. But standing there with the promise of a new day warming the horizon and the quiet strength of the man beside her, Isabella Beaumont felt no fear. She was home. That is the story of Isabella Beaumont and the Shoshone warrior, a tale not just of romance, but of resilience, justice, and the incredible power of a single choice. It shows us that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting in spite of it. Theirs was an alliance that redrew the map of a valley, proving that shared purpose can bridge any divide, and that even in the harshest wilderness, the most unexpected bonds can bloom. Their story reminds us that history isn't just made by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people who refuse to bow to hatred and injustice. If this story of courage and unlikely love in the Old West moved you, please help us share it with others. Hit that like button, share this video with your friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more true tales of the American frontier. Your support allows us to keep these incredible stories alive. Thank you for listening.